Imagine lying in complete darkness, nearly 1,000 meters underground, with a fractured skull. You're bleeding, you're freezing, and the way out requires squeezing through passages so narrow that even healthy individuals struggle to pass through them. If you were in that situation, would you lose hope? This is exactly what happened to 52-year-old Johann Westhauser in the depths of Germany's Riesending Cave in June 2014. And what followed would become one of the most complex and dangerous rescue operations in caving history. On June 8, 2014, Johann and two fellow researchers were exploring the Riesending Cave in the Bavarian Alps, nearly a kilometer below the surface, mapping uncharted sections. They were experienced cavers who had spent years exploring this massive underground system. But at approximately 1,000 meters deep, everything went horribly wrong. A rock fell. Johann's head was split open. Riesending Cave is located in the Untersberg Massif near Berchtesgaden in southeastern Germany. Discovered in 1995, the cave is one of the country's deepest, plunging 1,148 meters, approximately 3,766 feet, into the earth. The cave isn't just deep. It's a labyrinth of vertical shafts, narrow passages, underground rivers, and chambers that require advanced technical climbing skills to traverse. To reach the deeper sections, cavers must use ropes and specialized equipment to descend through areas that are essentially underground cliffs. Some passages are so narrow that explorers can only squeeze through by completely exhaling their breath. The temperature inside hovers just above freezing, and water constantly drips from above, soaking everyone who enters. Johann Westhauser was no amateur. At 52 years old, he was one of Germany's most experienced cave researchers. He had spent decades exploring underground systems and was part of the team that initially mapped significant portions of Riesending. On June 8, 2014, Johann descended into the cave with two colleagues to continue their research work. The team had established several camps at different depths throughout the cave, much like mountaineers set up camps at high altitudes. These camps provided shelter, supplies, and rest points during multi-day explorations. Johann's team was working near Camp 3, approximately 1,000 meters below the entrance, when disaster struck. As Johann was passing through one of the passages, a rock estimated to weigh approximately 10 kilograms or 22 pounds suddenly broke loose from the cave ceiling and struck him directly on the head. The impact was devastating. Johann's helmet absorbed some of the force, but it wasn't enough. He immediately collapsed, blood gushing from a severe head wound. His two companions rushed to his side. Johann was conscious but severely injured. He had a fractured skull, was bleeding profusely, and was going into shock. But here's what made this situation absolutely horrifying. They were nearly a kilometer deep underground in one of Germany's deepest caves. The route to the surface required climbing vertical shafts, squeezing through impossibly narrow passages, and navigating technical sections that even healthy, experienced cavers found challenging. And Johann couldn't walk. He couldn't climb. He could barely remain conscious. One of Johann's companions immediately began climbing toward the surface to alert authorities. The journey from 1,000 meters deep to the entrance normally took approximately 7 to 10 hours for experienced cavers. Even under emergency conditions, despite moving as quickly as possible, hours passed before the alarm could be raised. When German authorities received the emergency call, they immediately understood the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't just a cave rescue operation. This would be one of the most complex operations ever attempted in Europe. Within hours, a massive mobilization began. cave rescue teams from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and Croatia were contacted. Specialized equipment was helicoptered to the area. Medical personnel, technical climbing experts, and logistics coordinators flooded into the small mountain community. As the operation proceeded at full speed, more than 700 people would be involved in the effort to rescue Johann Westhauser. Have you ever thought about what so many people could do for a stranger? Perhaps humanity is more beautiful than we think. But before they could reach Johann, they needed to solve a fundamental problem. The passages leading to him were so narrow and technical that only the most experienced cavers could pass through them. And these cavers would need to transport medical supplies, warming equipment, food, and eventually a specially designed rescue stretcher through passages barely wide enough for a single person. The first rescuers reached Johann approximately 12 hours after the accident. When they arrived, they found him in critical condition. The head wound was serious. He was experiencing hypothermia due to temperatures near freezing, and perhaps most critically, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. The medical personnel who reached him immediately began administering treatment. They stabilized the head wound, provided warming blankets, set up a small heating system, and gave him fluids and medications. But everyone knew that Johann's only chance of survival was getting him out of the cave, and that presented an almost impossible challenge. So what does it take to rescue someone from 1,000 meters underground? The answer will shock you. The rescue plan was terrifying in its complexity. Teams would need to widen certain passages using small controlled explosions and hand tools. They would build a special stretcher that could be maneuvered through narrow sections. They would establish supply lines throughout the cave, working with teams positioned at different depths to transfer equipment and the stretcher from one section to another. Most critically, Johann would need to remain conscious and cooperative during parts of the ascent. There were sections so narrow that even the stretcher couldn't fit. In those areas, Johann would need to be manually guided, squeezing his injured body through spaces barely wide enough for a healthy person. The operation began on June 9th. Rescuers worked in shifts, 24 hours without interruption. Some teams focused on widening passages. Others transported equipment. Medical personnel constantly monitored Johann's condition, administering medications to ensure he didn't slip into a coma or succumb to hypothermia. The conditions the rescuers faced were merciless. They worked in temperatures near freezing, constantly soaked by dripping water. The passages were so narrow that in some sections, rescuers had to work lying flat on their stomachs in spaces barely wide enough to move their arms. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and the psychological stress of working in such extreme conditions affected everyone. Days passed. Teams slowly, carefully moved Johann upward through the cave system while he remained trapped underground. Every meter gained was a victory. Every hour that passed was an hour Johann's body endured the cold and his wound didn't worsen further. On June 11th, the third day of the operation, Johann's condition began deteriorating more rapidly. His body temperature was dropping dangerously despite the warming equipment. Though the head wound had been stabilized, it still posed a life-threatening risk. The medical team knew time was running out. The rescuers intensified their efforts. Teams worked until completely exhausted, then were replaced by fresh crews. The widened, narrow passages were still critical bottlenecks where the stretcher barely fit. In some sections, the stretcher, with Johann strapped inside, had to be tilted at extreme angles to turn corners and pass through tight squeezes. By June 15th, 7 days after the accident, Johann had been brought approximately halfway to the surface. But the most difficult sections still lay ahead. The upper portions of the cave contained some of the narrowest passages and most technical vertical climbs. On June 18th, the 10th day of the operation, the rescuers encountered one of the most challenging obstacles. A section called the Crying Passage was so narrow and so difficult that even experienced cavers feared it. Getting the stretcher through would require careful coordination, precise movements, and incredible patience. Team after team worked for hours. The stretcher was maneuvered through the passage, millimeter by millimeter. Johann, semi-conscious and in terrible pain, had to be repositioned many times. At one point, rescuers weren't sure if they could get him through, but they refused to give up. Finally, on June 19, 2014, 11 days after being struck by that falling rock, Johann Westhauser emerged from the entrance of Riesending Cave. He was immediately helicoptered to a hospital in Salzburg, Austria. He was suffering from severe hypothermia, the head wound was critical, and he had lost significant weight. But he was alive. The rescue operation had involved more than 700 people from 5 different countries. It had required over 200 individual cave trips, thousands of hours of labor, and coordination on a scale rarely seen in rescue operations. Specialized equipment had been designed and manufactured specifically for this rescue. Passages had been permanently modified to allow the stretcher to pass. Johann Westhauser spent weeks in intensive care recovering from his injuries. The head trauma required multiple surgeries. The hypothermia had caused damage to his extremities. But remarkably, he survived. And even more remarkably, he eventually returned to cave exploration, though he never again descended to the depths of Riesending. The Riesending Cave rescue operation stands as a testament to human determination and the incredible risks that rescue teams will take to save a single life. 700 people worked for 11 days in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, all to bring one injured man back to the surface. Johann Westhauser's story is a stark reminder of how vulnerable even the most experienced explorers are when venturing into Earth's deepest places. A single falling rock, a moment of bad luck, and suddenly the question becomes whether rescue is even possible. But this wasn't the only time a cave system tested the limits of what rescuers could accomplish. In Thailand's Tam Luang Cave, 12 young soccer players and their coach would become trapped in such a hopeless scenario with rising floodwaters that experts from around the world would say rescue was impossible. What happened next would captivate the entire planet and push cave rescue techniques into territory no one had ever attempted before. Thank you so much for watching this far. If you enjoyed my video, you can check out more on my YouTube channel and subscribe for even more content. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to write it in the comments.